Welcome to Getting Our Reward Heads Together, the podcast for reward and HR leaders brought to you by Reward Heads. Each episode we explore the ideas, challenges and innovations shaping how organisations design, deliver and talk about reward. We're a boutique consultancy creating bespoke solutions for our clients, but we'll tell you more about that after the episode. For now, let's get started. Hi, I'm Victoria Milford, founder and CEO of Reward Heads. Welcome to the latest Reward Heads podcast. Today we're going to be talking about reward in the third sector. So that's mainly charities and not-for-profits, and some of the challenges that they are facing and approaches that they're taking to address them. I'm joined by one of our consulting managers, Christina Jones, who's worked with lots of clients in the third sector. So Christina, many of our clients are from this sector and we get great attendance at our third sector forums. They sometimes face quite unique challenges, don't they?
Hi Victoria, they do, yes. So we actually did a poll at our last third sector forum and we asked our attendees to rank their reward concerns from highest to lowest. And the responses were largely driven by the same issues we see in any sector. So, for example, the living wages, whether that's voluntary or the national living wage, and how that takes up the majority of the pay budget. Also, how that impacts on pay differentials and creates pay compression. And managing employee expectations around pay. So, really no different from what we hear in any other sector. But how they tackle those challenges will be very different.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that is down to how different their sources of funding or income are from the commercial sector.
Absolutely. So funding is a huge consideration. And even within the third sector itself, there will be a variety of ways in which income can be generated. So some might be through membership. So there may be a little bit more flexibility in adjusting prices to bring more funds in. But actually that's quite rare, and so we see more being through fundraising or grants, perhaps government or corporate contracts, which give very little leeway in funding to set salaries. And there is an acceptance that at more senior levels, third sector pay is generally going to be lower than in the private sector. But I think the challenge now is that at those lower levels, pay isn't less because of the living wages. And so charities now face exactly the same issue about how to manage salary reviews when there's less budget to go around. And of course, how that impacts on maintaining pay differentials, but within an even more constrained budget.
Yes, and the living wages are really on everyone's mind at the moment, aren't they? So that's really regardless of which sector they're in. So we know what the Living Wage Foundation numbers are, but at the time of recording, the budget hasn't happened. And so we're still waiting to find out about the national living wage and the minimum wages. But we've got a direction of travel.
Yeah, and, you know, it does make budgeting and forecasting the knock-on quite difficult. But even though we don't know the exact numbers, we do know that these are going to be more than inflation again. But what I do find interesting is that we see more third sector organisations committing to paying the voluntary living wage, whether that's formally by becoming accredited or just by making a commitment that that's going to be their aim, than we do in the private sector, which is often driven more by the national living wage. And in some cases, I think that's down to size. So we tend to see smaller organisations in the third sector. But I think it's more down to organisational values and culture, which can be very different in the third sector. So there tends to be a much bigger focus on well-being and also consistency across the organisation in terms of total reward, rather than the tiering of benefits, for example, that we see in more corporate settings.
So let's share about some of the projects that you've been working on recently with our third sector clients. Would you say that there's any kind of common theme?
In a way, yes, because a lot of the work has been around pay benchmarking and pay structures. But as I alluded to earlier, each organisation is unique and so will need a solution that's right for them. And so this is a perfect example of where there is no typical approach that we should or could follow. And we do get asked what other charities do because that's often a consideration for our clients. But we tend to be more about understanding the needs of the organisation and creating something that's going to work for them rather than just pulling an off-the-shelf approach or even assuming that what might work in one organisation will work in another just because they're in the same sector.
Yes, so we find the questions can be the same, but not necessarily the answers, and that sort of leads to our bespoke approach.
Yeah, absolutely. And something else we've been looking at recently has been a number of clients that have outdated pay frameworks. So they're starting to become unaffordable and restrictive, and they want to try and move to a more flexible model. And in particular, we see this where there are lots of grades and perhaps spinal points or pay increments in place, typically in health and social care settings, where there's an overlap in skills with the public sector and in particular the NHS. And that's quite challenging because employees may have an expectation that pay will be structured in the same way, even if the monetary values are not the same. Perhaps that's against the NHS agenda for change. But it doesn't always work so well for charities, in part because those guaranteed increases and movement up a pay framework isn't always giving them a return. So it isn't linked to performance or skills and expertise, but it does cost a lot of money, and that's not sustainable for many. And it might also mean that there are a few different frameworks in place because we don't tend to see the same sort of framework, like spinal points and pay increments for central function roles, for example, and that creates complexity across the organisation.
Yeah, and one thing that I notice is people sort of rushing towards the solution. So almost getting into the real detail of a reward plan without being absolutely clear what they're trying to deliver and what their principles are.
Yes, and we sometimes start the project with a back to basics session almost. So we get the leadership team together to talk about what they actually want to pay for and what's going to work for them. And that's where we find a strategy or a total reward workshop works really well. And it's not often that the whole leadership team have that dedicated time to talk about reward across the entire organisation. So they really find it quite a valuable exercise.
Well, we do like a good strategy session, don't we? And it's important in any organisation that the leaders of the business are aligned, and this is such a huge topic. So how do you think reward strategy differs in the third sector to other sectors that we work in?
Well, what I do see is a different approach to total reward. So it's rare that we see the tiering of benefits, for example. Typically, benefits are available to all employees across the organisation, perhaps with the exception of executives. And actually, one of the things we talk about in our total reward sessions is the analogy of a pyramid, where the basic reward elements sit at the bottom and the less tangible elements sit higher up. And at the bottom of the pyramid, there are those basic needs that have to be met. So base pay has to be enough to cover basic costs of living, for example. And there are some benefits that are just expected, like decent annual leave, good family-friendly policies, or a pension that's going to help you plan for your retirement. But then as you move up through the pyramid, it's those less tangible elements at the top that can help organisations differentiate themselves. And it's what you call the Toblerone at the top of the pyramid, isn't it?
Yes, we should probably say other chocolate bars are available, but we refer to it as a Toblerone simply because it is that triangle that sits at the top. Either that or it's my obsession with chocolate.
I do think the third sector do this really well, though. They have to find a way to attract talent into the organisation when pay budgets are limited. And the way that they do that is by having a clear purpose, a specific culture, and by ensuring that they align to their values. So the ethos is very different, and sometimes that's what charities have to pull on when they're competing for talent with the public sector or even private sectors.
Yes, of course, bonuses are very rare in the sector, as there's a desire to really invest whatever money they do have in user outcomes. And of course, we don't see LTIPs and shares. So there are fewer levers that employers can pull in the sector, aren't there?
Yeah, so it really becomes about base pay, the benefits, and then those things that are at the top of the pyramid.
And you mentioned earlier about transferable skills between sectors. And one thing it was making me think about is we often hear the challenge that frontline workers in the third sector who are in quite demanding and sometimes quite distressing roles are making comparisons to someone, sitting on the till in the supermarket and receiving the same level of pay as them. Do you think that's still an issue?
In part, yes, because that's absolutely the reality in some cases. However, I think we see fewer private sector organisations paying the voluntary living wage, so there could be examples where charities slightly overtake the private sector. But we know that there's always competition between the supermarkets, for example, and them paying higher than the rest of the retail sector. And so the entry-level pay rates are always going to create a challenge. And, there's no getting away from the fact that frontline charity workers work really hard and often do roles that many of us would find particularly challenging. But there are a few things that can be done. So firstly, think about the total reward offering and the employee value proposition and find those things that you don't get in the private sector. We know that people who join charities do so because they want to make a difference, and so you have to make sure that they're able to do that.
Yes, and I guess it's what differentiates you as an employer.
Yeah, it's creating a culture that people want to stay in and also making sure that people feel recognised and rewarded for their efforts. I've actually worked with a few clients recently who operate in the health and social care setting and who just can't compete with the NHS on pay or benefits and who have lost people to the NHS as a result. But what's interesting is that they do sometimes hear from those people, and whilst the pay might have been attractive, the culture is very different. So it's not always a case of the grass being greener. But I do think charities have to get good at selling their reward package and their employee value proposition. And we know that communication around reward is often what's lacking. So this is definitely an area that organisations need to invest some time in.
Absolutely. And we say that across all sectors, don't we? That an awful lot of effort is put into reward schemes and structures and benefits. And then sometimes they get a bit forgotten about, whereas just recommunicating can make a massive difference for quite low cost.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So thanks for sharing your insights, Christina. As we said, Reward Heads works with lots of clients in the sector and we've built up good knowledge and experience of it. And of course, all of our projects and solutions are bespoke to each client as we reference, but we can draw on that insight. So if we can help you, please get in touch on rewardsolutions@rewardheads.co.uk, or you can contact either of us directly on victoria@rewardheads.co.uk or Christina@rewardheads.co.uk. Goodness me, how do people do this on TV all the time? Or our LinkedIn page.
Yes, and if you are HR or reward in the sector, you might want to join our free forum group where we share insights and experiences. So again, you can contact us on rewardsolutions@rewardheads.co.uk.
Thanks for listening to Getting Our Reward Heads Together, brought to you by Reward Heads. We're a boutique reward consultancy working with organisations across the UK and beyond. Our mission is to help HR and reward leaders design fair, engaging and effective reward frameworks and solutions, from pay and benefits to recognition and governance. Every solution we create is bespoke, built around each client's unique goals and challenges. We also offer coaching, resourcing and trusted forums to keep you connected to the latest reward trends. If we can support your reward journey, we'd love to hear from you.